Tonight, we're tackling something we all desperately need, and yet so many of us feel like we're failing at: sleep. You're lying in bed. It's 3 in the morning. The ceiling has become the most interesting thing in the universe, and your brain has decided now is the perfect time to replay every awkward conversation you've had since middle school. You feel that familiar tide of anxiety rising. You're convinced something is broken, that you're failing at the most basic, fundamental human function: rest. But what if I told you that this entire obsession, this desperate, white-knuckled quest for a perfect, solid 8-hour block, is a historical anomaly? What if that 3 a.m. wake-up call isn't a sign that you're broken, but a faint, forgotten echo of how our bodies are actually supposed to sleep? Before we deep dive into the history, my name is Boris, and I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what was the best part of your day? Feel free to share it in the comments below. Now, settle in. Let's drift gently into the past. It turns out our ancestors were holding on to a secret about rest that we have managed to completely forget. They didn't sleep once, they slept twice. This isn't just some historical curiosity. It's a lost science that could completely change the way you think about your own restless nights. It's a story about light, darkness, and a forgotten state of consciousness that our modern world has systematically erased. And understanding it might just be the key to finally making peace with the night. The idea that our whole concept of a normal night's sleep is a modern invention sounds pretty bold, but it's backed by a mountain of evidence we just weren't seeing. We were so convinced that one long, consolidated sleep was the biological default that we missed all the clues hiding in plain sight. The person who really blew the lid off this whole thing is a historian from Virginia Tech named Roger E. Kirch. Back in the 1990s, he was researching a book about life at night before the Industrial Revolution, and he started noticing a strange pattern. Across hundreds of documents, we're talking diaries, court records, medical texts, even epic poems, he kept finding these casual, offhand references to something called the first sleep. At first, it was just a fragment here and there, but as he pulled on the thread, an incredible picture started to emerge. He eventually catalogued over 500 references to a sleep pattern that, for centuries, was incredibly common. This wasn't some quirk. In much of the Western world, it was the default setting for the night. The pattern was biphasic, meaning it happened in 2 parts. People would go to bed a couple of hours after sunset, maybe around 9 or 10 p.m. They'd sleep for 3 or 4 hours, what they called their first sleep. Then, sometime after midnight, they would just wake up. They'd stay awake for an hour or 2 in a state of quiet consciousness before heading back to bed for their second sleep, which would take them to the morning. And the evidence for this is everywhere once you know to look for it. It pops up in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales from the 14th century, where a character decides to go back to bed after her first sleep. For Chaucer and his audience, this was about as remarkable as mentioning that someone put on their shoes. It's in a novel by Charles Dickens, where a character is startled from his first sleep. A 16th century French physician even advised that couples trying to conceive should wait until after their premier sommeil, their first sleep, because they'd be more rested and, well, you get the idea. Legal papers, personal letters, plays, they all mention it so casually that it's clear it needed no explanation. One 16th century writer noted that the time after the first sleep was the quietest time for conference. It was simply the built-in geography of the night. And this wasn't just a European thing. Researchers found that this pattern continued in some indigenous societies in places like Nigeria and Central America well into the 20th century. The trail even seems to go further back into the ancient world. Kirch found references that hint at biphasic sleep in some of our oldest literature, like Homer's Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid. Now, some historians who love a good debate argue that we should be careful about interpreting every single ancient reference as proof of a rigid universal system, and they have a point. The historical record is nuanced, but the overwhelming weight of evidence from daily life reveals a world that slept in a way we can barely fathom. A time when the night wasn't a single dark void to be conquered, but a landscape with its own distinct territories. The gentle slope into the first sleep, the quiet, wakeful valley in the middle, and the final climb toward dawn. So the question is, why? Was this just a habit, or was it wired into us all along? The reason our ancestors slept in two phases isn't because they were following some kind of trend. It's because their bodies were responding directly to their environment, a world that didn't have a switch on the wall that could mimic the sun. To get this, we have to look at the elegant, ancient machinery in our brains that runs the whole show, the circadian rhythm. Circadian just means around a day, and it's your body's internal 24-hour clock. It's the neurotic little manager of your entire daily schedule, running everything from your hormone levels to your body temperature and metabolism. The master gear in this whole system is a tiny cluster of neurons in your hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. Its location is key. It sits right above where the optic nerves from your eyes cross. It's basically wired directly to your eyeballs. When light comes in, the SCN gets a memo telling it whether it's day or night, and it uses that info to sync your internal clock with the outside world. Here's how it works in a natural setting. The sun goes down, darkness falls, and the SCN detects the lack of light. It sends a signal to the pineal gland, giving it the all-clear to start pumping out melatonin, often called the hormone of darkness. As melatonin levels rise, you get sleepy. It's your body's official bedtime memo. In the pre-industrial world, people would listen to that signal and fall into their first sleep. But here's the crucial part. In the 1990s, a psychiatrist named Thomas Ware ran a brilliant experiment that gave us the biological proof for what Eckhart found in the history books. He took a group of guys and basically put them into a kind of biological time machine, simulating long pre-industrial winter nights. For 14 hours a day, they were in total darkness, with no artificial light at all. For the first few weeks, they slept like us, in one solid chunk. But by the fourth week, something remarkable happened. Spontaneously, their sleep patterns reorganized. They started sleeping for about 4 hours, waking up for 1 to 3 hours, and then falling back asleep for another 4 hours. Without any prompting, their bodies had defaulted back to the biphasic pattern of their ancestors. It turns out this rhythm isn't just a historical footnote. It seems to be our brain's pre-programmed factory setting when you take away the disruptive force of modern light. That period in the middle, known as the watch, wasn't the angsty, frustrating insomnia we know today. It was a biochemically unique state of consciousness. After that first restorative sleep, the brain was in a profoundly calm, meditative state. We have a clue as to why. During this phase, the brain is bathed in high levels of a hormone called prolactin. Prolactin promotes a feeling of deep tranquility and calm. This created a state of peaceful, dreamy introspection that is completely alien to the alert, cortisol-fueled stress we feel when we wake up at 3 a.m. And this time wasn't seen as a disruption, it was seen as useful, a gift. People would mend things by the glow of the embers, pray, or have quiet conversations with their spouses. It was a time for intimacy and self-reflection, all facilitated by a unique neurochemical state brought on by the natural rhythm of the night. It was a quiet, private territory that our modern world has completely paved over. So if this was so natural and so beneficial, where did it go? Why did we trade it for the relentless 8-hour block we now worship? For millennia, human life was governed by the rhythm of the sun. The night was a vast, dark ocean, and sleep was a journey with a quiet island of wakefulness in the middle. Then, in just a couple of generations, everything changed. This ancient, biologically ingrained pattern didn't just fade away, it was actively hunted down and extinguished by the Industrial Revolution. This great sleep transformation began not with a bang, but with a flicker, the flicker of a gas lamp on a city street. The first and most powerful weapon against the old way of sleep was artificial light. Throughout the 19th century, gas and then electric light began to conquer the night. More importantly, it invaded our homes. A world once lit by the warm, dim glow of a fire became a world where day could be summoned with a switch. This had a devastating effect on our delicate circadian machinery. As the sleep scientist Dr. Charles Chisler famously said, "Every time we turn on a light, we are inadvertently taking a drug that affects how we will sleep." Bright evening light tricks the SCN into thinking it's still daytime, slamming the brakes on melatonin production. As the lines between day and night blurred, people started going to bed later. But the factory whistle and the office clock still demanded they wake up at the same time. The night got squeezed. The first thing to be squeezed out was that leisurely hour or two of wakefulness in the middle. It was an indulgence the modern world decided it couldn't afford. But technology was only half the story. The Industrial Revolution brought a new religion: efficiency. Every hour was an economic unit that had to be productive. Suddenly, the old ways of sleeping were seen through a critical new lens. That quiet, contemplative watch was no longer a time for reflection. It was a waste of time. Lying awake in bed was reframed as a sign of laziness, a moral failing. By the early 20th century, medical journals were championing a single, uninterrupted sleep as the ideal for a healthy, efficient, and morally upright person. Waking up at night was no longer normal. It was a problem to be fixed, a disorder. Within a few generations, we had forgotten a pattern of sleep that had served us for thousands of years. We successfully industrialized our sleep, and then we invented the myth of the perfect, uninterrupted 8 hours to go with it. We took a natural human rhythm, turned it into a pathology, and created a collective anxiety that now haunts our nights. So here we are, trying to force our ancient biology into a modern schedule that is, historically, a radical and very recent experiment. The obvious question is, what are we supposed to do with this knowledge? Should we all smash our light bulbs and try to live like 16th century farmers, churning butter at 2 a.m.? For most of us, probably not. Our lives are built around a single block of sleep. But the point of uncovering this lost science isn't to perfectly copy the past. It's to take its wisdom and apply it to the present. And the lessons it holds can radically change our relationship with sleep and, more importantly, dial down the anxiety so many of us feel. The single most powerful idea we can take from our ancestors is this: waking up in the middle of the night is not automatically a malfunction. It is not necessarily a disorder called insomnia. For many of us, it is very likely a deep biological echo of our body's natural rhythm. Just knowing this can be transformative. Think about it. One of the biggest things that keeps you awake at night is the panic about being awake. You check the clock, you do the frantic math, you worry about the next day. That stress releases cortisol, which makes you more alert, and now you're in a vicious cycle. Understanding that this wakefulness was once normal helps you reframe the entire experience. Instead of seeing yourself as an insomniac, you can see yourself as someone whose body is just tuned to an older frequency. This shift in perspective can diffuse the panic and create the calm you need to drift back to sleep. It replaces anxiety with acceptance. Practically, what does this look like? First, if you find yourself awake at night, don't fight it. Lying there tossing and turning only makes it worse. Embrace the wisdom of the waking watch. If you're not asleep after 20 minutes or so, get out of bed. Go to another room and do something quiet and relaxing in very dim light. Read a real book, not a screen. Listen to calm music, or just sit quietly. The key is to keep the lights low and the activity calm. Then, when you feel genuinely sleepy again, go back to bed. You're not giving up. You're honoring a natural rhythm. Second, become a guardian of your darkness. Our bodies need darkness to make melatonin. Make your bedroom a sanctuary from light. Black out curtains, covering electronics, do what you have to do. And most importantly, create an artificial dusk for yourself. Limit your exposure to bright screens for at least an hour before bed to give your brain the signal that it's time to wind down. I'm genuinely curious to hear from you on this. If this idea of reframing sleep anxiety resonates, or if you're one of the many people who regularly wakes up in the middle of the night, what's your experience? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into the forgotten corners of the past to find better ways to live now, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. The story of segmented sleep is more than just a cool piece of historical trivia. It's a profound reminder that so many things we assume are universal are actually recent inventions. The 8-hour, uninterrupted sleep is a construct of the modern world, a world of clocks, factories, and artificial light. For almost all of human history, the night was a different country. People slept twice, and in that space between, they found a unique quiet for contemplation and connection. We may not be able to return to that world, but by rediscovering its lost rhythms, we get a powerful new lens to see our own struggles. It teaches us that the frustration we feel when the clock says 3 a.m. isn't an inherent part of being awake, but a modern anxiety we've learned. It tells us that the solution might not be a new gadget, but a very old understanding, to be kinder to ourselves, to respect the power of darkness, and to accept that a quiet moment of wakefulness in the night is not a failure, but a deep ancestral memory. By unraveling this lost science, we learn that the path to better rest might not be about forcing an unnatural perfection, but about finally making peace with the night. Imagine the floor beneath you carrying a gentle vibration, not from the sudden boom of an earthquake, but from the constant humming energy of a million lives gathered in one space. From the street below, a current of sound rises, the turning of cartwheels, the distant calls of merchants, a donkey's bray, a soldier's passing comment, and the smell. The smell is a presence in the air. It's the blended scent of sweat, wood smoke, wine, and underneath it all, the ever-present aroma of a city breathing and living. This isn't the Rome of emperors dressed in fine silks. This isn't the Rome of gleaming marble temples and grand processions. This is the Rome of the other 99%, the Rome of the common man and woman, the plebeian, the laborer, whose life was a steady and continuous effort. When we picture the Roman Empire, our minds often turn to images of grandeur and glory, of senators debating in the Forum and gladiators in the Colosseum. But that was a spectacle, a carefully presented vision. The true story of Rome, the engine that powered its 1,000-year history, is found in quiet, compact apartments, in dusty workshops, and across sun-drenched fields. It's the story of ordinary people, whose lives were a gentle rhythm of hardship, community, and simple, fleeting joys. Today, we're moving past the palace gates and arena walls to spend a day in their world. We'll meet Lucius, a baker making his way in the heart of the city, and his cousin Marcus, a farmer whose life is tied to the quiet patterns of the land hundreds of miles away. Through their eyes, we'll uncover the unfiltered reality of how the vast majority of people truly lived, worked, and found their way in the Roman Empire. The day for Lucius, our baker, begins not with a sudden sunrise, but with a quiet stirring in the dark. Sleep is a precious and shallow state, easily disturbed. He lives with his wife and 2 young children on the 4th floor of an insula, an apartment block in the Suburra, one of Rome's most populated neighborhoods. The word insula literally means island, a fitting name for these towering blocks that rose like cliffs from a sea of people. There were no penthouses in ancient Rome. The higher you lived, the simpler your dwelling. The most desirable apartments were on the ground floor, but up here, life is different. Lucius's home, a cubiculum, is a single small room without windows. The air is heavy with smoke from the brazier he lit for a little warmth, a constant awareness in a building made of wood and brick. He knows that fire is an ever-present risk. A knocked-over lamp could spread through the building, a concern for everyone on the upper floors. The stability of the building is another thought that lingers. These structures were often built by landlords looking to maximize their space, sometimes with less than solid foundations. He rises from a simple straw mattress on the floor. There is no running water this high up. His wife is already awake, preparing for the day and managing the household, a significant task in such a small space. For sanitation, they use a chamber pot. Later, its contents will be carried down 4 flights of stairs to a cesspit or, under the cover of darkness, emptied into the street below. The lack of widespread sanitation meant that illness could spread easily. Every drop of water for drinking, cooking, and washing has to be carried by hand from the nearest public fountain, a daily chore for his wife or older child. Breakfast, or ientaculum, is simple. There's little time or space for a large meal. They have a piece of coarse bread, perhaps with a bit of cheese or a few olives, and some water. It's just enough to begin the day. As Lucius prepares to leave, the city is already coming to life. He can hear the soft clatter of wooden shutters on the tabernae, the ground floor shops, being opened. He hears the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer and the growing hum of thousands of conversations. The sounds drift up the narrow streets, creating a symphony that will continue until long after dark. He gives his wife a quiet nod, acknowledging the day ahead for both of them, and heads down the steep, dark staircase. When he steps into the street, he is immediately part of the flowing crowd. The air here is a complex mix of smells: fresh bread from a bakery, tanning leather, refuse from the day before, and the scent of ammonia from the fullers cleaning togas with urine. This collection of sensations is Rome, and for Lucius, another day of work has begun. The Roman workday begins with the sun. For most people, the plebs, life is centered on labor. Many work a steady 6-hour day, from dawn until about noon, after which the city's attention turns to leisure. Lucius moves through the crowded streets to the Pistrinum, the bakery where he works. It is not his own. Like many craftsmen, he works for a wage that is just enough to cover his rent and food. The bakery is a hive of activity. The air is warm and thick with flour dust. Massive hourglass-shaped mills, made of heavy volcanic stone, are being turned by donkeys or, in larger establishments, by slaves. It is steady, physical work. Lucius's job is at the ovens. He has to maintain the correct temperature, sliding dozens of loaves in and out of the heat with a long wooden paddle. The warmth is intense, and the work is continuous. Bread is the staple of the Roman diet, and the city's bakeries are essential, operating day and night. The world of Roman work was incredibly diverse. Walking through his neighborhood, Lucius passes dozens of different trades: weavers, leather workers, butchers, and masons, all working in small, open-fronted shops. Large construction projects, like repairing aqueducts or building a new temple, employ great numbers of unskilled laborers for a daily wage. And underlying it all is the institution of slavery. Slaves performed every kind of task, from the most difficult labor in mines and fields to highly skilled jobs. Many teachers, doctors, and architects in Rome were educated slaves from Greece and other parts of the empire. They worked in homes, managed businesses, and were a fundamental part of the Roman economy. A skilled craftsman like Lucius is a free man, but he must coexist with slave labor, a reality that influenced wages and his own employment. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the life of Lucius's cousin, Marcus, is governed by the sun and the seasons. As much as 90% of the Roman Empire's population lived in the countryside, working the land. Marcus is a colonus, a tenant farmer. He does not own his small plot of land. It belongs to a wealthy senator who lives in a grand villa miles away. Marcus pays his rent with a large portion of his crop, leaving just enough for his family to live on. His day also starts at dawn, but to the sounds of his ox and the calls of birds. His work is just as demanding as Lucius's, if not more so. He spends his days ploughing, sowing, weeding, and during the harvest, working from sunrise to sunset. His entire family contributes. His wife manages the household, spins wool for their clothes, tends a small vegetable garden, and prepares their simple meals. His children help in the fields from a young age. Their school is the farm, their lesson survival. Unlike the urban poor in Rome who could sometimes rely on the state's grain dole, the Annona, Marcus, and his family depend entirely on what they can produce. A drought, a flood, or a blight on the crops could mean hardship. While life was challenging, some peasant farmers did own their own land and sold surplus goods at local markets. But for many like Marcus, life was one of steady obligation to a distant landlord and a state that required taxes. Whether in the city or the country, work was hard and the rewards were modest. For the 99%, the Roman Empire wasn't built on marble and gold, but on sweat, toil, and quiet labor. The popular image of a Roman meal is often a lavish banquet, with elites dining on exotic dishes. While those feasts did occur, for Lucius, Marcus, and most of the population, the daily reality of food was a world away. Their diet was simple, consistent, and centered on one thing: grain. Back in Rome, the morning's work is done. Around noon, Lucius takes a break for prandium, or lunch. It's a simple, unheated meal, often leftovers from the night before, another piece of bread, some fruit, or a handful of nuts, perhaps bought from a street vendor. The main meal of the day is the cena, or dinner, eaten in the late afternoon. For the wealthy, this could be a multi-course event. For Lucius and his family, it's a humble gathering. Cooking in the compact wooden insulae was often restricted because of the risk of fire, so many of the urban poor relied on popinae, or cook shops, which were the ancient equivalent of fast food establishments, selling warm stews and sausages. If Lucius's family eats at home, the main dish is pulse, a thick porridge made from boiled wheat or barley. It was the foundational dish of the Roman poor. They might add some affordable vegetables like lentils, leeks, or cabbage. Meat was a special treat. A family like Lucius's might only have pork on special occasions. Fish was more common, especially salted fish, and a pungent fermented fish sauce called garum was used on almost everything to add flavor. For the poorest in the city, survival often depended on the annona, the monthly grain dole from the state. This distribution of free or subsidized grain was a key part of Roman civic life, intended to keep the massive urban population fed and stable, part of the famous bread and circuses policy. In the countryside, Marcus's diet consists of what he grows. His meals are also based on grain porridge and coarse, homemade bread. He has better access to fresh vegetables from his garden and perhaps some fruit. A few chickens might provide eggs, and cheese from goats or sheep's milk was a common source of protein. As in the city, meat was not a daily staple. They might have some pork or lamb during a festival, but their diet was mostly vegetarian. Their main drink was an inexpensive wine, always heavily diluted with water. The greatest contrast in Roman society could be seen on the dining table. While a wealthy patrician might spend a fortune on a single banquet, the 99% were sustained by the Mediterranean triad: grains, olives, and grapes, as bread, olive oil, and simple wine. Their food wasn't about elaborate pleasure, it was about sustenance. It was the fuel for another day of hard labor. With the workday often ending around noon, the Roman afternoon was a time for leisure. This wasn't just about rest, but about important social customs and hygiene. For Lucius, after a long morning at the bakery, there's one place he and almost every other man in Rome is headed: the public baths, or thermae. The baths were the true heart of Roman social life. They were magnificent structures, often funded by emperors, and for a very small fee, they were open to nearly everyone. They were a great social meeting point where different classes could mingle together. Entering the baths was like stepping into another world. The scale was immense, with different rooms, pools, courtyards, libraries, and gardens. The air was filled with a chorus of sounds: splashing water, conversations, the exertions of athletes, and vendors selling snacks. Lucius pays his small entrance fee and leaves his clothes in a locker room, the apoditerium, mindful of his belongings. The bathing ritual was a well-established routine. He might start by exercising in the palaestra or exercise yard. Then he would move to the tepidarium, the warm room, followed by the caldarium, the hot room, to soothe his muscles. Romans didn't use soap as we do. Instead, they covered themselves in oil and scraped it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil, which removed the dirt along with the oil. Finally, he'd take a cool plunge in the frigidarium. But the baths were more than just about getting clean. They were a community center, a social club, and a wellness space all in one. This is where Lucius would hear the latest news and gossip, discuss politics, or even make business arrangements. It was his main social outlet. After the baths, Lucius might stop at a local corpona or popina, a tavern or wine bar. The elite tended to look down on these places as humble spots for drinking and games, but for Lucius and his friends, they were a place to unwind with a cup of watered-down wine and a quiet game of dice. And then there was the grand spectacle, the games. The chariot races at the Circus Maximus and the gladiatorial contests at the Colosseum were free to the public, the most famous examples of bread and circuses. A day at the games was a rare and powerful escape from the daily routine. The gladiator games were a major form of public entertainment and a powerful symbol of the state, reminding everyone of the emperor's influence. For Marcus in the countryside, leisure was different. His work often lasted well into the afternoon. His free time was connected to local religious festivals that marked the changing of the seasons. These were times for the whole community to gather, share a meal, and socialize. Market days were also important social events, a chance to go to the nearest town, sell some surplus produce, and connect with people from outside his village, feeling part of the wider Roman world. His leisure was less about spectacle and more about community. As dusk begins to fall, Lucius heads back to his insula. The streets are still full of people, but shops are closing and families are returning home for the cena. For the Roman family, or familia, this was the main unifying moment of the day. The Roman familia was led by the paterfamilias, the eldest male, who held legal authority, patria potestas, over his entire household, including his wife, children, and any slaves. In principle, this authority was absolute, extending even to decisions about newborns. In practice, for an ordinary family like Lucius's, this power was often expressed through affection and the practical needs of daily life. His relationship with his wife was a partnership for survival. His wife, the materfamilias, held a respected role within the home. She managed the household finances, procured food, made clothing, and raised the children. Roman women usually married young, often in their early teens, typically to older men. For their children, life was demanding. Childhood was not the protected period it is today. Formal education was a luxury. Children in families like Lucius's were expected to contribute to the household as soon as they were able. His son might soon begin to help at the bakery, while his daughter would learn domestic skills from her mother. Before their simple dinner of porridge and vegetables, the family performs a daily ritual. In a small niche in the wall is their lararium, a household shrine. Here they keep small figures of the lares, the spirits of their ancestors, and the penates, the spirits that guarded the household's food supply. Lucius leads a simple prayer and makes a small offering, a pinch of flour or a drop of wine. This daily act of worship was deeply woven into the fabric of Roman life, a quiet way to seek protection and good fortune. As night falls, the city transforms. With no streetlights, the narrow lanes of Rome become dark and quiet. It was wise to be cautious, as the darkness could provide cover for thieves. The family secures the door to their small room, finding safety in their shared space. For Marcus, the end of the day in the countryside is even quieter. After a simple supper, the family might gather around the hearth. Storytelling and folk songs might fill the evening hours. The darkness outside is complete, broken only by the sounds of nature. Their concerns were not of city dangers, but of wolves that might threaten their livestock. His life was a world away from the urban energy of Rome, yet both he and Lucius were bound by the same realities: the structure of the familiar, the importance of household gods, and the centrality of family in a challenging world. The lives of Lucius and Marcus, one urban and one rural, show us a side of Rome we rarely see. It's a story not of grand monuments, but of quiet resilience. As our day with Lucius and Marcus comes to a close, we are left with a very different picture of the Roman Empire. The gleaming marble of the Capitol was a beautiful stage. The real story was lived every day by the millions of anonymous souls who made up the 99%. Their lives were a quiet testament to human endurance. They woke before dawn in homes that were simple and humble. They worked in workshops and fields, their labor fueling an empire while providing for their own families. They ate plain, consistent meals of bread and porridge, a world away from the fabled feasts of the elite. Yet their lives were not just about hardship. There was community. There was the warm camaraderie of the public baths, a uniquely Roman place where society came together. There were the simple pleasures of the tavern and the shared spectacle of the games, moments of escape. And most importantly, there was family and neighborhood, the foundation of their world, held together by shared rituals, household gods, and a common journey. The true story of Rome's endurance isn't just in its aqueducts, legions, or emperors. It's in the steady, day-to-day effort of its ordinary people. It's in the baker, covered in flour, pulling bread from a warm oven to feed the city. It's in the farmer, his back tired, tending to his crops under a provincial sun. They were the silent, essential foundation upon which the grand Roman Empire was built. Their lives, in all their simple, challenging, and profoundly human detail, are the real, enduring legacy of Rome. Power in Rome wasn't just seized, it was cultivated. For 500 years, the Roman Republic looked like a government of the people, with its elected officials and grand assemblies. But that was a carefully constructed illusion. Behind the marble columns and the roar of the crowds, a totally different kind of power was at play. This was a power held not by citizens, but by a handful of elite families, a Roman 1% who wrote the rules for everyone else. They were the patrician aristocracy, the ancient houses who claimed they could trace their families all the way back to the founding of Rome. Families like the Cornelii, the Fabii, and the Claudii didn't just take part in politics. They owned it. They controlled the Senate, they led the legions, and they piled up so much wealth it could fund entire wars. This wasn't some lucky accident. It was the result of a deliberate multi-generational strategy, a secret playbook for absolute power, passed down from father to son. This is the story of that playbook. It's a guide to how a tiny, entrenched elite built unshakable dynasties and ruthlessly crushed any rival who dared to get in their way. This is how they mastered the game of Roman power, not by playing by the rules, but by writing them. In the Roman Republic, a system that praised the common citizen, the state was actually an elective oligarchy. For centuries, fewer than 50 powerful families had a total monopoly on the highest political offices, the priesthoods, and all the top military commands. They operated in a world where your family name, your genes, meant more than your actual talent, and where the path to power wasn't a ladder anyone could climb. It was a closed circle, open only to the chosen few. This is the first rule of the playbook. Power is a birthright, not a reward. The heart of the Roman Republic, its most sacred institution, was the Senate. In theory, it was just an advisory body, full of former officials offering their wisdom for the good of the state. But let's be real. The Senate was the ultimate old boys club, the central boardroom where the elite families managed their shared empire. Its decrees carried immense weight, and any politician who dared to ignore them was basically committing career suicide. If you controlled the Senate, you controlled the Republic. So, how did they pull it off? First, you had to control who even got a foot in the door. The only path to the Senate was through the cursus honorum, the course of honor, a ladder of public offices you had to climb. From the lowly rank of quaestor to the absolute pinnacle of power, the consulship, every single step was designed to be ruinously expensive. Candidates were just expected to pay for public games, put up new buildings, and basically buy the love of the voters. This created a massive financial wall. Only people with huge family fortunes could even think about a life in politics. The system wasn't built to find the best and brightest. It was built to filter out anyone who wasn't already rich. Even the voting itself was a masterpiece of manipulation. The main voting assembly, the Comitia Centuriata, was split into blocks based on wealth. The richest citizens had way more influence, their votes counting for far more than those of the poor. The whole thing was an elaborate show, a performance of democracy meant to give the illusion of choice while making sure the outcome was always the same. Another aristocrat from a big-name family taking office. No family played this game better than the Cornelii. For over 700 years, this one patrician house was a political and military juggernaut. They produced more consuls and generals than any other family in Roman history, a staggering 75 consuls during the Republic alone. They were a dynasty in all but name, one of the gentes maiores, or greatest families, who dominated the Republic for centuries. Men like Scipio Africanus, the guy who defeated Hannibal, weren't just brilliant generals. They were products of a system their family had perfected. The Cornelii knew that personal ambition was best served by collective family power. This power wasn't just built on politics. It was cemented through a complex web of social duties and strategic alliances. Don't even think about love when it comes to elite Roman marriage. It was a cold, calculated move for political and economic gain. Marriages were planned down to the last detail to merge powerful families, forge alliances, and get a political edge. When Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, had his sister Octavia marry his rival Mark Antony, it was a pure political play to shore up a shaky alliance. The women of these families were often just pawns in a patriarchal game, their marriages used to consolidate power. A divorce could break an alliance, and a new marriage could create one, shifting the whole political landscape. But maybe the most clever tool of control was the patron-client system. This was the invisible framework holding Roman society together. A powerful aristocrat, the patron, would give his lower-class clients money, legal help, and social support. In return, these clients owed him their absolute loyalty. They voted how he told them to, they supported his campaigns, and they'd even follow him through the forum just to show off how influential he was. A powerful senator wasn't one man. He was the head of a network that could include thousands of clients, a ready-made voting bloc he could call on at any time. This system stretched from the streets of Rome all the way to the provinces, where entire nations could become client states, dependent on a powerful general or Rome itself. It was a system of obligation built on fides or faithfulness, but its deep inequality made it a powerful tool of exploitation, ensuring the masses stayed loyal to the very elites who ran their lives. Playing politics in the Senate was only one half of the playbook. The other, much more brutal half, was controlling the military. In the early days of the Republic, the army was a citizen militia. Farmers who owned land would serve for a season and then go back to their fields. Their loyalty was to the state, the Senate, and people of Rome. But as Rome's empire got bigger, its wars got longer and farther away. That system just couldn't last. The big turning point came in the late 2nd century BCE with the reforms of Gaius Marius. Facing a soldier shortage, Marius opened the legions to the capite censi, the landless poor, for the first time. He professionalized the army, giving them state-funded equipment and turning military service into a full-blown career. On the surface, this was a practical fix, but it had a revolutionary side effect. It completely changed who the soldiers were loyal to. These new soldiers weren't fighting for some abstract idea of the Republic. They were poor guys with nothing to lose. Their general was the one who promised them pay, a cut of the war plunder, and most importantly, a nice plot of land when they retired. Their loyalty was no longer to the Senate, which often dragged its feet on approving these land grants, but to their commander. The legions of Rome went from being the army of the state to the private armies of powerful generals. This was the second great rule of the playbook. He who controls the army controls Rome. The elite families were quick to exploit this new reality. A provincial governorship, which came with the command of its legions, became the ultimate prize. It was a license to print money and build a private power base. A successful war didn't just bring you glory, it brought unimaginable wealth from looting cities, selling captives into slavery, and controlling resources like mines. And it created legions of battle-hardened veterans who were fiercely loyal to their general and their general alone. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician from the great Cornelian clan, was one of the first to truly weaponize this new dynamic. He was a brilliant commander who fought with Marius before they became bitter enemies. When the Senate, under pressure from Marius, tried to strip Sulla of his command of a rich war in the east, he did the unthinkable. He gave a speech to his soldiers, convincing them that Marius and the Senate were trying to steal their rightful plunder. His legions, now loyal only to him, agreed. In 88 BCE, for the first time in Roman history, a general marched his army on Rome itself. It was a Rubicon moment that the Republic would never recover from. The precedent was set. From now on, military force was the final answer in any political argument. The next generation of ambitious aristocrats learned Sulla's lesson all too well. Pompey the Great raised his own private armies to fight for the Senate. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, used his fortune to fund his own legions. And then, there was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar's conquest of Gaul is the ultimate case study in using military power for political gain. For nearly a decade, he led his legions in a series of brilliant campaigns. He became fabulously wealthy, but more importantly, he built an army with unmatched experience and devotion. His soldiers didn't just follow him, They worshipped him. He shared their struggles, knew their names, and rewarded them generously. When the Senate, terrified of his growing power, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, he had a choice: obey and face his political enemies in court, or follow Sulla's example. Like Sulla, he took his case directly to his men. He crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, plunging the Republic into a devastating civil war. The armies that squared off weren't fighting for Rome. It was Caesar's legions against Pompey's legions. The state was just the prize. The soldiers' loyalty to their commanders had completely replaced their loyalty to the Republic. This shift, which started with Marius's reforms, had created the very warlords who would tear the system apart, each one a product of the elite class, each one following the playbook to its logical, violent end. Politics and war were the twin engines of elite power, and they were both fueled by one thing: money. The fortunes piled up by Rome's 1% were almost impossible to imagine. They weren't just rich, they operated on a scale that let them privatize the functions of the state. The third rule of the playbook was simple: get rich by any means necessary, and use that wealth to make the state depend on you. The main source of this incredible wealth was conquest. A successful war meant plunder on an industrial scale. Entire cities were sacked, their treasuries looted, their art stolen, and their people sold into slavery. This flood of cash went straight into the pockets of the commanding general and his officers, and by extension, their families back in Rome. But the most reliable path to getting rich was a provincial governorship. A governor had absolute power in his province: military, administrative, and judicial. With no one from the Senate thousands of miles away to effectively check them, a governorship was a 3-year license to steal. The practice was so common, it became a cynical joke. It was said a governor needed to get rich 3 times over. First, to pay off the bribes it took to get the job. Second, to plunder the province for his own fortune. And third, to build a slush fund to bribe the jury at his inevitable corruption trial when he got back to Rome. The case of Gaius Verres is probably the most infamous example of this system-wide corruption. As governor of Sicily from 73 to 71 BCE, Verres went on a looting spree so shameless it became legendary. He hit farmers with illegal grain taxes that drove them off their land. He used his judicial power to steal inheritances from wealthy Sicilians. But his real passion was art. He sent gangs of thugs to scour the island, forcing people to sell him priceless Greek statues and paintings for pennies, stripping temples and private homes bare. When he was finally put on trial, his prosecutor, a young, ambitious politician named Cicero, presented so much evidence that Verres's own lawyer gave up and he skipped town into exile before the verdict was even read. Verres was an extreme case, but his methods weren't unique. He was just a greedier product of a deeply corrupt system. This dirty money was then plowed right back into the system to generate more power. The elite owned vast agricultural estates called latifundia, massive plantations worked by armies of slaves, many of whom were the prisoners from their own wars. These mega-farms squeezed out the small citizen farmers, the very backbone of the early republic, forcing them off their land and into the cities, where they became a landless, dependent mob. This created a social crisis that the elite were more than happy to exploit. The displaced poor became clients, dependent on the handouts of their wealthy patrons. The elite used their fortunes to fund spectacular gladiatorial games and public works projects, not out of civic duty, but to buy the love of the masses. And most critically, they used their money to bankroll their political careers and those of their allies. Elections were bought and sold. Votes were openly bribed. The entire political machine ran on the grease of aristocratic money. It was a self-perpetuating cycle. A family used its wealth to get political office. That office gave them command of an army. That army let them conquer new lands, which brought in more wealth. That wealth was then used to grab more political power for the next generation. It was a closed loop, a system designed to concentrate wealth and power into the same few hands, generation after generation. The first 3 rules of the playbook, master the Senate, control the legions, and amass overwhelming wealth, were for building power. But there was a 4th, final, and most brutal rule. When a challenger appears who can't be bought, co-opted, or outmaneuvered, they must be eliminated, without mercy. For centuries, the elite families competed among themselves for fame and office, but they always closed ranks against an existential threat. And that threat was anyone who tried to break their monopoly on power, especially those who tried to appeal directly to the people, the so-called populares. The story of the Gracchi brothers is the ultimate cautionary tale for anyone who dared to challenge the system. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were aristocrats themselves, grandsons of the great Scipio Africanus from the Cornelian clan. They were insiders. But they saw the crisis brewing in the Republic. Small farmers losing their land, the rise of a permanent urban poor, and the dangerous concentration of land in the hands of the rich. In 133 BCE, as a tribune of the plebs, Tiberius Gracchus proposed a land reform law that seemed pretty moderate. His law aimed to redistribute public land that the wealthy elite had been illegally squatting on for generations and give it to the landless poor. He wasn't trying to overthrow the system. He was trying to save it from its own greed. But to the senatorial elite, this was a declaration of war. It was an attack on their property and, by extension, their power. When Tiberius used some unconventional political moves to pass his law and then tried to get re-elected to protect it, the elites decided he'd gone too far. Fearing his popularity with the people, a group of senators, led by his own cousin, took matters into their own hands. They marched out of the Senate, stormed a political rally with their supporters, and in the riot that followed, Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death. It was a shocking moment. For the first time in centuries, political violence had been used as a tool right in the city of Rome, setting a dark and bloody precedent. A decade later, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up the cause. Bolder than his brother, Gaius passed a whole slate of new laws as tribune, not just redistributing land, but also subsidizing grain for the urban poor and challenging the Senate's power over the courts. He was directly attacking the pillars of elite control. The Senate's reaction was swift and final. They passed a new decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of the Senate. This was basically a declaration of martial law, giving the consuls the power to do whatever it took to protect the Republic. In reality, it was a death sentence. Gaius was declared an enemy of the state. Hunted through the streets of Rome, he was either killed by his pursuers or took his own life to avoid being captured. In the aftermath, thousands of his followers were rounded up and executed without a trial. The message was brutally clear. The 1% would not tolerate any real challenge to their authority. Reform would be met with violence. Populism would be met with murder. The Gracchi brothers had tried to use the Republic's own institutions to fix it, and the ruling class had responded by tearing down those very institutions to protect their own privilege. This tactic of violent elimination only got worse. Decades later, the dictator Sulla perfected the method when he returned to Rome. He created the proscriptions, a legalized campaign of political murder. He posted lists of his political enemies in the forum. Anyone on the list could be killed with impunity, and the killer would get a reward. Their property and lands were seized and auctioned off, usually for cheap, to Sulla's own supporters. This wasn't random violence. It was a systematic, calculated purge designed to wipe out all opposition and remake the ruling class into one loyal only to him. Hundreds of senators and over 1,000 equestrians were killed. Their sons and grandsons were banned from holding public office, an attempt to extinguish entire family lines of opposition. The playbook had evolved from targeted assassination to state-sanctioned terror. It was the ultimate tool for maintaining absolute power. If you can't control a rival, destroy them completely. The story of Rome's elite is a timeless lesson in how power is won, held, and lost. These strategies of political manipulation, economic control, and ruthless suppression aren't just stuck in the ancient world. You can see their echoes in the boardrooms, political arenas, and power struggles of our own time. If you find these dynamics of power as fascinating as I do, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next look into the hidden forces that shape our world. And let me know in the comments, which Roman family do you think was the best at playing this dangerous game? The secret playbook of Rome's 1% was a masterclass in building and keeping dynastic power. It was a 4-part strategy carried out over centuries. First, master the political system from the inside, rigging it with financial and social barriers that turned the Senate into your own private club. Second, grab control of the military, turning the legions from a state army into the private enforcers of ambitious generals. Third, get filthy rich through conquest and corruption, then use that money to buy political careers and trap everyone else in a web of dependency. And finally, when a real challenger comes along who threatens your monopoly, eliminate them without a second thought. It was a brutally effective strategy. But the playbook had the seeds of its own destruction baked right in. The constant competition it created among the elite families just got more and more violent. The political rules and institutions of the Republic were torn down not by foreign enemies, but by the very men who claimed to be its guardians. Introducing private armies and political murder into the heart of Rome created a death spiral that there was no pulling out of. The civil wars that ended the Republic weren't a surprise. They were the inevitable result of this playbook. The fight was no longer between political ideas, but between powerful warlords: Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, Antony, Octavian, each one the head of a powerful dynasty, each fighting for total control. In the end, one family won the game. After decades of bloodshed, it was Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, who came out on top. He ruthlessly eliminated all his rivals, and then, in a stroke of pure genius, he perfected the playbook. He announced that the Republic was restored, keeping all the old institutions in place: the Senate, the consuls, the assemblies. But it was all a show. In reality, he held all the power. He controlled every legion. He had a personal fortune bigger than the state treasury, and he had the final say on every single decision. The elite families hadn't been destroyed, they had just been put on a leash. They could keep playing their little games, but now there was a new, permanent master. The old playbook, designed for an oligarchy of competing families, had been rewritten for a one-man dictatorship. The great houses of Rome had spent centuries perfecting the strategies for absolute power, only to watch one of their own use those same strategies to rise above them all, ending the Republic and creating the ultimate dynasty, the Roman Emperor.